The Wyoming wind was a razor honed on 1,000 miles of rock and dust. It sliced across Helena Ward's cheek, catching in the raised silvered lines of her scars and making her good eye water. The stagecoach, a bone-jarring box of wood and leather, lurched through another rut, throwing her against the worn seat. Across from her, a portly salesman in a sweat-stained bowler hat snored softly, oblivious to the unforgiving landscape that bled into a bruised purple sky. Helena's hand, thin and pale, instinctively went to the silver locket resting against the high collar of her dress. Its cool, smooth surface was a familiar anchor in a world that had offered her none. It was all she had left of her mother, of a life before the fire, before the whispers and the averted gazes. The locket was her history, a silent testament to a memory of warmth and love that felt as distant as a star. She was returning to a ghost, the town of redemption, a name so full of bitter irony it felt like a personal taunt from God himself. She hadn't been back in 15 years, not since the night the world had burned down around her, leaving her marked and alone. An inheritance, a small dusty plot of land her father had owned, thought worthless, had finally been settled by some far-flung lawyer. It was a final, tenuous thread to a past she had tried to outrun, and she had come to sever it for good. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves and the creak of the leather harnesses was a lulling, monotonous drone. Then it broke. A sharp crack like a whip snapping echoed across the plains. It was a rifle shot. The salesman jolted awake with a snort, his eyes wide and panicked. The stagecoach driver shouted something raw and unintelligible, and the vehicle slewed sideways, its wheels screaming in the dirt. Helena was thrown forward, her shoulders striking the opposite wall. Outside, the world dissolved into a chaos of panicked whinnies and guttural yells. The door was wrenched open, flooding the cramped interior with harsh, blinding sunlight. A man filled the space, a grimy bandana pulled up over his nose, leaving only a pair of cruel, calculating eyes visible. The barrel of a Colt revolver, dark and absolute, was leveled at the salesman's trembling chin. Wallets, jewelry, anything that shines, as the man rasped, his voice a gravelly ruin. Two other men, similarly masked, appeared at the windows, their own weapons making the threat complete. The salesman fumbled with his coat, his fingers clumsy with fear. He produced a worn leather wallet and a gold watch, pushing them toward the outlaw with a pathetic whimper. Helena remained perfectly still. She had no money to speak of, no jewelry of any value. Except for one thing. The leader's eyes, cold as a winter creek, settled on her. They flickered down to the delicate silver chain that disappeared beneath her collar. "You too, miss." The necklace. A cold dread far deeper than the fear of any gun coiled in Helena's stomach. "It's of no value," she said, her voice quiet but firm, betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. "I'll be the judge of that," he sneered. "Hand it over." "No." The word was a stone dropped into a still pond. The salesman stared at her aghast. The outlaw's eyes narrowed. He took a half step into the coach, the smell of stale sweat and whiskey rolling off him in a suffocating wave. He reached for her. Instinct, honed by years of guarding herself against a hostile world, took over. Helena recoiled, pressing herself into the corner of the coach. "I said no." His patience snapped. With a curse, he lunged, his grimy hand grabbing for the chain. But before his fingers could close around it, a blur of motion outside the opposite window caught his eye. It was followed by a sound that was not a gunshot, not a yell, but a soft, final thwack. The outlaw at the left window stiffened, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He made a small gurgling sound, and then slumped forward, an arrow protruding from the back of his neck, its gray goose fletching stark against the dusty fabric of his shirt. The leader froze, his head whipping around. The third man, positioned near the horses, let out a choked cry before he too crumpled to the ground, a second arrow sprouting from his chest. The world fell into an unnerving silence, broken only by the whistling of the wind and the nervous stamping of the horses. The leader inside the coach stared, his mind struggling to process the sudden, silent annihilation of his men. He backed out of the doorway slowly, his revolver now sweeping the empty horizon. "Who's out there?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Show yourself." There was no answer. He took another step back, his eyes darting wildly. From the shadow of a towering rock formation 100 yards away, a figure emerged. He was not walking but flowing over the terrain, a silent gliding presence that seemed part of the land itself. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin leggings and a simple tunic. His long black hair was unbound, and in his hand he held a powerful bow. He was Sue. The outlaw Jed let out a nervous, incredulous laugh. "Just one Injun," he raised his Colt. "This is your last day, Redskin." He fired. The shot was a deafening roar that sent the salesman cowering to the floor. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust a good 10 feet to the left of the approaching warrior. Jed cursed and fired again, and then a third time, each shot as wild and panicked as the last. The Sioux warrior did not flinch. He did not slow. He simply continued his fluid, unhurried advance. When he was 50 yards away, he stopped, drew another arrow from the quiver on his back, and knocked it to the string. The movement was a single, seamless act of lethal grace. Jed's bravado evaporated, replaced by raw terror. He fumbled to reload his pistol, his hands shaking so badly he dropped a cartridge in the dust. He looked up, his face a mask of primal fear. The warrior's aim was steady, the point of the arrow a black speck of impending death. The bowstring sang. Jed screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short as the arrow took him in the throat. He staggered backward, his hands flying to his neck, his eyes wide with the ultimate surprise. He fell to his knees and then pitched forward into the dirt, silent. The coach was still. The driver, who had been hiding behind the front wheel, slowly peeked out. The salesman was a trembling heap on the floor. Helena, however, was on her feet. She stepped out of the coach and into the harsh light, her gaze fixed on the man who had just saved her. He approached without a sound, his moccasins making no impression on the hard-packed earth. Up close, he was even more formidable. His face was all sharp angles and stoic lines, his dark eyes holding a depth that seemed to reflect the vast, empty sky above them. He was not a mystical hero from a dime novel. He was a man of visceral, deadly competence. He moved to the fallen outlaws, retrieving his arrows with an air of detached practicality, wiping them clean on the dead men's shirts before returning them to his quiver. His work done, he turned his attention to her. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, Helena saw something other than impassive skill. There was a flicker of curiosity, a brief questioning glance that lingered on the scarred side of her face. Not with pity, but with a kind of neutral appraisal. She clutched the locket, its metal now warm from her skin. Her voice when she found it was barely a whisper. "I'm obliged." The warrior gave a slow, deliberate nod. He looked past her toward the distant, hazy outline of the mountains that bracketed the town of Redemption. He said nothing. Words seemed unnecessary, clumsy things in the face of what had just transpired. A life debt had been incurred, a strange and violent covenant struck between two strangers on a dusty trail. He turned and began to walk away, his form slowly melting back into the landscape from which he had emerged. "Wait," Helena called out, a sudden urgency in her voice. He stopped, turning his head slightly to look at her over his shoulder. "What is your name?" His gaze held hers for a long moment. "Chayton," he said. The name was like the wind itself, strong, clean, and wild. Then, without another word, he was gone, leaving Helena standing in the profound silence of the Wyoming plains, the weight of her locket feeling heavier than ever before. The journey to redemption had begun not with a quiet arrival, but with bloodshed and an unlikely savior. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the past she had come to bury was not nearly as dead as she had hoped. The town of Redemption huddled in the valley, like a collection of weathered bones bleached by the sun. Its main street was a wide, dusty artery, flanked by two-story buildings with false fronts and peeling paint. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and the sheriff's office stood as weary sentinels of a fragile civilization. The air itself seemed to shimmer with heat, thick with the scent of horse manure wood smoke, and something else, a faint underlying tension like the quiet hum before a lightning strike. As Helena stepped down from the stagecoach, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, despite the heat, she felt the town's eyes on her. Glances slid toward her, then quickly away. It was a familiar dance of curiosity and revulsion she had endured for 15 years. They saw the scars first. They always did. The web of silvered tissue that pulled at the corner of her left eye and ran down her cheek to her jawline was a map of a nightmare. And people, she had learned, did not like to be reminded of such things. A man separated himself from the small crowd gathered in front of the Redemption Hotel. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit. His silver hair neatly combed his face, handsome, in a way that seemed both practiced and predatory. He moved with an easy proprietary grace, as if the very dust of the street belonged to him. "Miss Ward," he said, his voice as smooth as polished riverstone. He extended a manicured hand. "Silas Kane. It is a profound pleasure to welcome you back to Redemption." Helena hesitated before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, his skin surprisingly cool. This was the man her lawyer's letter had mentioned, the pillar of the community, who had overseen the town's growth. "Mr. Kane," she replied, her voice low. "A terrible ordeal on the road," I hear Kane said, his eyes crinkling with what looked like sympathy. "We are all so relieved you are unharmed. This territory can be untamed." The word felt deliberately chosen. He was looking directly at her, but his gaze seemed to see through her, to weigh and measure her. She felt an instinctive prickle of distrust. "I was fortunate," she said, withdrawing her hand. "Indeed. Fortunate." He smiled, a flash of perfectly white teeth. "Now you must be exhausted. I've taken the liberty of securing you a room at the hotel. The best one, of course. We must take care of our own." The possessive pronoun hung in the air. Helena had no desire to be his charity, but she had little choice. She nodded her thanks, her throat tight. Later, from the window of her small but clean hotel room, she watched the town settle into the rhythms of the evening. The setting sun bled across the horizon, casting the blood-red mesas looming like sleeping giants against the sky in long, distorted shadows. Her thoughts drifted back to the ambush and to the man named Chayton. He had saved her life, yet she felt a disquieting sense of unease. He was a force of nature untamed as the land itself, and his sudden appearance felt like an omen. The next morning, Helena set out to begin her grim task. Her first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was a man whose weariness seemed etched into his very bones. His face was a roadmap of broken veins, his mustache drooped with a permanent air of disappointment, and his tin star was tarnished. "Miss Ward," he said, not rising from his chair, which groaned under his weight. He gestured to a rickety seat opposite his cluttered desk. "Heard you had some excitement yesterday. Kane's already filled me in." "The men who attacked the coach," Helena began. "One of them got away, didn't he? The driver said he saw one ride off during the confusion." Sheriff Miller sighed a long, rattling sound. "Name's Jed. A low-life drifter. He'll be halfway to Montana by now. Nothing to worry about." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Listen, miss. This is rough country. A woman on her own, especially a woman of your delicate constitution. It's not safe. My advice, settle your father's affairs with Kane and get on the first coach heading east." His words, meant perhaps as a kindness, felt like a dismissal. She was being told once again that she was too broken to belong. She left the office with a feeling of deep frustration. It seemed no one in Redemption wanted her to do anything but disappear. Her next stop was O'Malley's General Store, a cavernous space that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. A plump, rosy-cheeked woman with kind eyes and an insatiable curiosity was polishing the glass countertop. "Helena Ward." The woman breathed, her eyes widening. "My heavens. I remember you as a little girl. I'm Martha O'Malley." She leaned closer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It was a terrible thing what happened to your family. A terrible, terrible accident." "The fire," Helena stated the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. "Yes, the fire," Martha confirmed, nodding vigorously. "That new stove your father had installed? The sheriff said it must have been faulty. A tragedy. Your father, Thomas, he was a good man. Ambitious, though. He and Mr. Kane, they were going to build an empire out here. Did you know that partners they were? Their names were right there next to each other in the old town ledger, big as you please. Ward and Kane Enterprises." The information struck Helena with the force of a physical blow. Her father and Silas Kane. Partners. The lawyer's dry letters had spoken only of her father's solitary landholdings. Kane, in his polished greeting, had presented himself merely as a concerned citizen. I didn't know," Helena stammered. "Oh, yes," Martha continued, warming to her subject. "They owned half the valley between them. But after the accident, Mr. Kane had to dissolve the partnership. Bought out your father's share from the estate, he said, to keep things tidy. A very generous man, Mr. Kane. He's done so much for this town." A cold suspicion began to crystallize in Helena's mind. Generous or opportunistic? She spent the rest of the day at the county clerk's office, a small stuffy room filled with the scent of aging paper. She found the ledger Martha had mentioned, and there it was, in faded ink, Ward and Kane Enterprises. Page after page detailed land purchases, water rights agreements, and survey maps. Her father had been far more than a simple homesteader. He had been a visionary poised on the edge of building a dynasty. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped, followed by a single curt legal filing dissolving the partnership due to the death of Thomas Ward, with all assets transferred to the surviving partner, Silas Kane. It was too neat, too clean. That night, sleep offered no escape. Helena was haunted by dreams of fire, the smell of smoke, the heat on her skin. She awoke with a gasp, her heart pounding. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside her room. She held her breath, listening. Silence. She told herself it was just the old hotel settling, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next few days were a quiet war of nerves. She felt Kane's presence everywhere. He would nod to her on the street, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Men who looked a lot like the outlaws from the stagecoach robbery loitered near the hotel, their gazes hard and unfriendly. A near accident in the street where a galloping horse forced her to leap onto the boardwalk felt less like an accident and more like a warning. She took to walking at the edge of town during the long, quiet afternoons. It was there, near a shallow creek fringed with cottonwoods, that she saw him again. Chayton was sitting motionless by the water's edge, watching a hawk circle in the vast, empty blue above. He seemed to sense her approach, turning his head as she drew near. "You are still here," she said, the statement sounding more like a question. "The hunting is good," he replied, his voice calm and even. He spoke precise, thoughtful English, with none of the clipped, broken patterns she'd read about in books. It was another layer to the enigma he presented. She stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure of what to say. The debt she owed him was a heavy, unspoken thing between them. "The men who attacked me," she said finally. "One of them is in town. I've seen him." Chayton's gaze sharpened. "The one who ran. His heart is that of a scavenger. He follows the lion hoping for scraps." The lion. The man who shines on the outside but is dark within. Chayton set his eyes, turning toward the town. His words follow a crooked trail. He was talking about Cain. He had seen it too. In that moment, Helena realized she was not entirely alone. Chayton was an observer, a man who understood the subtle currents of predation that ran beneath the town's placid surface. "They think I'm weak," Helena said, the words coming out in a rush of frustration and anger. "Because of this." She gestured to her face. "They think I will break and run." Chayton looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. It settled on her scars, but for the first time she did not feel judged or pitied. He seemed to be reading the story written there, and his expression held not revulsion, but a deep, quiet respect. "A tree that is scarred by lightning is often the strongest in the forest," he said softly. "Its roots grow deeper." His words struck a chord deep inside her, soothing a wound she hadn't known was still so raw. He saw strength where everyone else saw only damage. Emboldened by his quiet solidarity and the damning evidence in the town ledger, Helena decided she could no longer wait for the truth to find her. She had to confront the lion in his den. That evening, she walked to Silas Cain's house, a grand 2-story mansion that stood on a hill overlooking redemption, a monument to his success. She found him in his study, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of leather and cigar smoke. He was standing by a large window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking down on the town as a king might survey his domain. "Miss Ward," he said without turning, "I had a feeling you would pay me a visit." He finally faced her, his smile a thin, dangerous line. "Have you come to accept my generous offer for your father's remaining plot of land?" "I came to talk about your partnership," Helena said, her voice steady. She held up a copy of the ledger page she had made. "Ward and Cain Enterprises." Cain's smile vanished. His eyes grew cold, the polite mask falling away to reveal the predator beneath. Ancient history. A business arrangement that was concluded tragically but legally. "My father and mother died in a fire caused by a faulty stove," Helena said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "And you, their partner, absorbed the entirety of a vast and profitable enterprise. It all seems remarkably convenient." Cain set his whiskey glass down with a soft click. He walked slowly toward her, his movements measured and menacing. "You have your father's stubbornness. It was his undoing." And then the truth came delivered in his smooth, chilling voice. "Your father was a fool," Cain began, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "He was a good surveyor, I'll grant him that, but a terrible businessman. He discovered that some of my land acquisitions were creatively documented. He found out I was selling water rights to streams that would run dry by midsummer. He called it fraud. I called it progress." Helena stared at him, horrified, the pieces of her past clicking into place with sickening clarity. He was going to expose me. Cain continued, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. Ruin everything I had built. He had all the proof in a deed box he kept in a safe in his study. I couldn't allow that. So I paid a couple of drifters to have a little accident at your home. A fire. Meant to look like a tragedy. It was supposed to be quick. Destroy the evidence, silence the witness. He paused, his eyes locking onto the locket at her throat. But the safe was empty. I've spent 15 years searching for that primary deed, the one that proved my original claims were fraudulent. I tore this valley apart looking for it. It was only recently I heard a rumor from an old associate of your father's that your mother had a sentimental habit. She liked to hide the most important things in plain sight. His gaze was now a physical thing, burning with avarice. The night of the fire, you were wearing that locket. I saw it as they pulled you from the flames. I never imagined. She wouldn't have put a legal document in a piece of jewelry. But she did, didn't she? The deed is in there. The world tilted on its axis. The locket, her one precious link to her mother, her most sacred memory, was also the evidence of a murderer's crime, and the key to his empire. The fire, the loss, the scars, it wasn't an accident. It was an execution. Give it to me. Helena, Cain said, his voice dropping to a silken threat. Give me the locket, and I will let you walk away from this town and never look back. Refuse, and I will finish the job I started 15 years ago. This time there will be no survivors. The room felt airless. Helena backed away, her hand protectively covering the locket. The man who had destroyed her life was standing before her, and the final piece of the puzzle was not a quest for land, but a deeply personal, long overdue reckoning. She turned and fled from the house, the monster's confession echoing in her ears, her heart pounding with a terror that was swiftly being forged into a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer a victim returning to a ghost. She was a survivor returning for justice. The night was a black, starless void. Helena ran from Cain's mansion, her lungs burning the gravel of the road, biting at the soles of her thin shoes. She didn't run toward the sterile safety of the hotel, but toward the edge of town, toward the creek and the cottonwoods. Her instincts screaming for the one person in this godforsaken place who had looked at her and not seen something broken. She found Chayton where she had known he would be. He was a silhouette against the faint moonlight, a still and patient presence. He rose as she stumbled into the clearing, her breath coming in ragged sobs. He didn't speak, just watched her with those steady, knowing eyes, as the whole story poured out of her, the partnership, the fraud, the fire, the confession, the locket. When she finished, the only sound was the chirping of crickets and the soft murmur of the creek. Chayton's face was impassive, carved from stone, but a new light burned in his eyes, a hard, dangerous fire. The dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. He was no longer a stranger who had saved her, a protector watching from a distance. He was now an ally bound to her, not just by a life debt, but by a shared understanding of the predator that stalked this valley. He is a man who poisons the water he drinks from. Chayton said, the condemnation in his voice low and absolute. Such a man must be stopped. I can't go to the sheriff, Helena said, wiping tears from her face with the back of her hand. Miller is useless. He's probably in Cain's pocket. She didn't know how right she was. It's just us. Sometimes that is enough, Chayton replied. He looked at her, his gaze holding a new intensity. This is your fight, Helena Ward. This is your story to finish. I will walk the path with you. A strange calm settled over Helena. For the first time in her life, She felt the solid ground of an alliance beneath her feet. They were two outcasts, a scarred woman and a Sioux warrior, against the most powerful man in the valley. The odds were impossible, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. "We can't face him in town," she said, her mind racing. "It's his territory. He has men everywhere." "Then we draw the serpent from his den," Chayton said. "We choose the ground." An idea born of pain and memory began to form. There was only one place this could end. The place it all began. A place of ghosts and ashes, a place that Cain would believe was her greatest weakness, but which she would now make her greatest strength. "The old homestead," she whispered. "The ruins of my family's home." Chayton nodded slowly, understanding immediately. It was a place of power, a place where the spirits of the wronged cried out for justice. The plan was simple and desperate. Helena found a boy in town, the stable hand, and paid him 2 bits to deliver a message to Silas Cain. The note was brief. "The old Ward homestead. Dawn, bring your bill of sale, and I will bring the deed. We finish this business for good." It was a bluff, a blatant trap. But Helena knew Cain's arrogance and greed would compel him to come. He would not trust a proxy. He would want to see the locket in his own hands to savor the final victory himself. He would come, and he would not come alone. They made their way to the ruins under the cover of darkness. The homestead was a skeletal silhouette on a low rise, its scorched timbers like broken ribs against the paling sky. The chimney stood as a lone, jagged tombstone. Walking through what was once her front door was like stepping into her own grave. The air was thick with the ghosts of laughter, of her mother's song, of her father's booming voice. The pain was a physical weight, threatening to crush her. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Chayton. "Do not let the ghosts of what was lost blind you to what you are fighting for now." He said, his voice a quiet anchor in the swirling sea of her grief. He was right. She straightened her back, the sorrow hardening into purpose. This was not a place of mourning anymore. It was a battlefield. Chayton moved through the ruins with silent expertise, studying the crumbling walls, the rotted floorboards, the precarious stack of stones that was once the hearth. He was reading the landscape of their trap, identifying its weaknesses and its strengths. On the western horizon, a dark, bruised line of clouds was gathering, and the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the gritty taste of dust. "A storm is coming," Chayton observed. "It will be our ally." As the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in sickly shades of orange and gray, they saw them, a small group of riders, approaching. Cain was in the lead, flanked by 4 men. One of them, even at a distance, had the familiar hulking shape of Jed. Helena's heart hammered against her ribs. She and Chayton took their positions, hidden within the shadows of the collapsed structure. The wind began to howl, a low moan that grew in intensity with every passing second. It whipped loose dust and ash into the air, creating a swirling, ghostly fog. Cain and his men dismounted, their guns drawn. They moved into the ruins cautiously, their eyes straining to pierce the growing gloom. Ward Cain's voice was a sharp, impatient bark, nearly snatched away by the wind. "Enough of this melodrama, show yourself." From the opposite side of the ruins, Chayton loosed an arrow. It wasn't aimed to kill. It embedded itself in the wooden frame of a burnt-out window inches from Jed's head with a solid thump. The men jumped, spinning around, their weapons pointed at the sound. It was the distraction Helena needed. She emerged from the shadows behind them. "I'm here, Cain." Cain turned a triumphant sneer on his face. "The locket. Now." "The truth first." Helena shot back, her voice rising above the shriek of the wind. "Say it. Tell your men why you're here. Tell them you murdered my family for a piece of paper." Jed laughed nervously. "She's crazy, boss." But Kane's eyes were locked on hers, a flicker of fury in their depths. The dust storm hit them then, a solid wall of red earth that plunged the world into a suffocating, chaotic twilight. The wind screamed like a banshee tearing at the loose timbers of the ruins. Visibility dropped to mere feet. It was the signal. Chayton became a phantom in the storm. An arrow flew from the swirling dust, and one of Kane's men cried out and fell. Another turned to fire blindly into the maelstrom, only to have Chayton emerge from the haze behind him, his knife a silent, deadly arc. Helena scrambled for cover behind the crumbling chimney as bullets tore through the air around her. Jed and another man were firing wildly, their shots panicked and inaccurate in the disorienting chaos. Kane roared orders that were lost in the gale. Chayton moved to engage the remaining two men, a whirlwind of buckskin and steel. He was a force of nature perfectly at home in the storm's embrace. But he was still only one man. As he took down one of the thugs, Jed got a lucky shot off. The bullet caught Chayton in the side, spinning him around. He grunted in pain and staggered, dropping to one knee, but bringing his bow up, firing one last arrow that struck Jed in the shoulder, sending the big man reeling back with a roar of agony. Just as Helena's hope began to falter, a new figure appeared at the edge of the ruins. Sheriff Miller. For a single fleeting moment, relief washed over her. The law had arrived. "Sheriff," she cried out, "thank God." Miller walked forward, his duster whipping around him in the wind. He raised his pistol, its barrel a dark, steady circle. But it wasn't pointed at Kane. It was pointed directly at her. "Sorry, Miss Ward," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Business is business." The betrayal was a cold, sharp blade to the heart. The secondary twist was a death blow. There was no help coming. She was alone. Chayton was wounded, and she was trapped between the man who had ordered her family's murder and the corrupt lawman paid to clean up the mess. Kane laughed, a raw, triumphant sound that was nearly swallowed by the storm. "Well done, Sheriff. Now kill her. We'll say she was caught in the crossfire." Miller took a step forward, his aim steady. But in that moment, Helena was no longer a victim. The fire that had scarred her had also forged something unbreakable inside her. She knew this place. She knew its weaknesses, its traps. "My father built this house to last." She screamed into the wind, her voice a raw cry of defiance. She stomped her foot hard on a section of floorboards near Miller, a spot she knew from childhood had been weakened by a leak in the old roof. The rotten wood, stressed by years of decay, gave way with a splintering crack. Miller cried out in surprise as the floor collapsed beneath him, sending him tumbling into the shallow root cellar below with a sickening thud. He was out of the fight. Now it was just her and Kane. He lunged at her, his face a mask of pure hatred. "You meddling little... I'll tear that locket from your neck." He was bigger, stronger. She couldn't fight him head on. She scrambled backward, her hands searching the rubble-strewn ground. Her fingers closed around a loose brick from the chimney. As he grabbed for her, she swung it with all her might, striking him on the side of the head. He staggered back, stunned, blood trickling from his temple. He roared in fury and came at her again. She backed away toward the teetering, blackened stones of the chimney. He saw her glance upward and sneered. "You think these old stones will save you?" "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "This will." She ripped the locket from her own neck, the chain breaking. She held it up, the silver gleaming faintly in the dusty gloom. "This is what you want, isn't it? The key to your kingdom." His eyes full of rabid greed fixed on it. With a final desperate prayer, she threw it. Not at him, but passed him into the darkest corner of the ruins. It was the one thing he could not resist. His obsession, his life's work. He forgot her, completely turning and lunging for the glint of silver in the dust. As his back was turned, Helena threw her entire weight against a loose, charred support beam propping up the weakened side of the chimney. It groaned, shifted, and then with a deafening rumble of grinding stone, the entire stack of masonry gave way. Silas Kane looked up from the dirt, his face a mask of sudden, horrified understanding. He had just enough time to scream before tons of rock and soot rained down, burying him completely. Justice delivered not by a bullet, but by the very foundation of the home he had destroyed. The wind began to die down. The dust started to settle. Silence, profound and absolute, fell over the ruins. It was over. Battered, bleeding, and covered in grime. Helena Ward stood tall amidst the wreckage of her past, the sole survivor of a war she was never meant to win. As the last echoes of the chimney's collapse faded, the dust began to settle, revealing a scene of quiet devastation. The Wyoming sky, cleansed by the storm, was a brilliant, aching blue. Helena stood panting, her body a symphony of pain and adrenaline, and looked upon the grave of rock and timber she had made for Silas Kane. There was no triumph, only a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion. The ghosts were finally quiet. A low groan brought her back to the present. Chayton. She rushed to his side. He was leaning against a broken wall, his hand pressed tight against the bloody wound in his side. His face was pale beneath his sun-darkened skin, but his eyes were clear and focused on her. "It is done," he said, his voice strained. "It is," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. She tore a strip of fabric from her petticoat and pressed it against his wound, her hands surprisingly steady. "We have to get you out of here." Together, they dealt with the aftermath. The man Chayton had shot was dead. Jed, clutching his shoulder, surrendered with a whimpering plea, his fight long gone. From the cellar, Sheriff Miller moaned, his leg broken in the fall. The serpent had been decapitated, and its fangs were drawn. The journey back to redemption was a slow, arduous procession. Helena drove Kane's own wagon with a bound Jed in the back, and Chayton lying on a bed of blankets, drifting in and out of consciousness. She walked into town not as a victim, but as a conqueror leading a parade of broken villains. The townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. They saw the corrupt sheriff, the wounded outlaw, and the pale, still form of the Sioux warrior. They saw Helena, her face smudged with soot and blood, her dress torn, standing tall and unbroken. And they understood. The truth, once revealed, spread through redemption like a wildfire. With Kane's death and Miller's confession, the rot at the town's core was exposed. The empire built on lies and blood crumbled into dust. Men who had feared Kane now spoke freely of his crimes, and families he had cheated came forward with their stories. A different kind of justice, a communal one, began to take hold. The weeks that followed were a blur of healing. Helena refused to leave Chayton's side, nursing him in a quiet room at the back of the doctor's office. She cleaned his wound, brought him broth, and sat with him in the long, silent hours of the night. In that small room, a new language formed between them, one of quiet gestures and shared understanding. Her touch was no longer hesitant, and his gaze held a warmth that went deeper than gratitude. They were two scarred people who had found in each other a place of quiet acceptance. The legalities were sorted out by a federal marshal who arrived from Cheyenne. Helena found the locket in the ruins, its silver surface dented but intact. Inside, just as Kane had suspected, was a small, tightly folded piece of parchment. It was the original deed to the entire northern valley, a vast expanse of rich grazing land. and more importantly, the headwaters of the river that fed the entire region. It was signed not just by her father, but by a Sioux elder Chayton's own grandfather. Her father hadn't been Cain's partner in theft. He had been forging a unique and respectful alliance with the land's original inhabitants. Cain hadn't just murdered a partner. He had destroyed a bridge between two worlds. The deed was legally filed. The Ward Valley, as it came to be known, was hers. Suddenly, she was no longer a penniless outcast, but one of the most powerful landowners in the territory. But the land, the wealth, it meant little to her. What mattered was that the truth was known. Her father's name was cleared. Her family's memory was honored. When Chayton was strong enough to walk, they rode out together to the ruins of her home. The rubble from the chimney had been cleared away, but the blackened foundation remained a scar on the earth. The afternoon sun was warm, and a gentle breeze whispered through the tall grass. Helena looked at the devastating emptiness. For 15 years, this place had been the source of all her pain. Now it was the site of her liberation. She no longer felt the need to run from it, nor the desire to rebuild it. The past could not be resurrected. Chayton stood beside her, his presence a quiet, solid comfort. He held a small green sapling in his hands, its roots carefully wrapped in burlap. A cottonwood, a tree of life and resilience. He offered it to her. She took it, its tender leaves brushing against her scarred cheek. Together, without a word, they dug a hole in the rich earth right in the center of the charred foundation. They placed the sapling inside, covering its roots, tamping down the soil with their hands. Helena stood and looked at their work. A tiny speck of green, of life, of future, rising from the ashes of her past. The sunlight caught the silvered lines on her face, but they were no longer a map of tragedy. They were a testament to the fact that the deepest wounds can heal, that the strongest things are often those that have been broken and remade. She looked at Chayton, and he looked at her. Their bond was not one of passionate declarations, but of something far deeper, a partnership forged in violence, tempered by loyalty, and sealed in mutual respect. A new story was beginning, not on the ashes of the old one, but growing from them, its roots running deep.